My name is Schalk Neethling, and this is the Mechanical Ink. Podcast, a podcast about open source, the open web, sustainability, and those who want to make the web and the world a better place. Hey, Jordan, and welcome to the Mechanical Ink. Podcast.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So I was introduced by Yuri?
Jory Burson, yeah.
That's it. I spoke to her and two of the other folks from Open Web Talks a little while ago on the podcast, and she said, you should speak to Jordan. I think you'll talk for days. And I was like, sure, hook us up.
Yeah.
And so,
that sounds great.
She hooked us up. And I'm not going to talk too much about stuff now, but I looked at your GitHub and I was like, holy Moses. Okay. There's a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, for sure.
So we'll dig into all of that. But for now, if you could tell us, who is Jordan and what makes you get out of bed in the morning?
Sure. So let's see. At the moment, I am not full-time employed. I'm contracting for the OpenJS Foundation, and then I maintain all of 400 plus open source projects. They're all on NPM except for NVM, which is NPM related. Going back through my career, I've been some of my more recent positions were building an open source office at a couple different companies. When I was at Airbnb, I was a web infrastructure engineer, but I ran their open source program basically in my free time. And after that is when I decided to try and do it a little more full time. I've been on TC39, which is the JavaScript Specification Standards Committee, since 2014. I was an editor for 3 years, and I'm at the moment I manage most of the GitHub stuff and champion a bunch of different proposals. As far as what makes me get out of bed in the morning, I've got a lot of different things. I have a family. I have, a spouse and kids. I have all of my open source projects, and occasionally I find some time for sleep and hobbies mixed into those.
Yeah, that sounds great. And yeah, there's a lot of open source, so we'll dig into that. But why open source? How did you get into open source?
I think so. Originally, I did a garage startup with some friends in the 2000s, and we used open source stuff, and so I kind of slowly got used to filing issues when something wasn't working. But it wasn't until 2010 when I had my first quote real developer job, where I was full-time employed in a company that was not me and my friends in a garage, and I had to fix a bug, and just sitting there and waiting for them to fix it wasn't an option. So I made a pull request, and I liked, being able to solve the problem for myself, but also for everyone else who uses that particular library. And it just sort of went off from there. I basically got, I think I really buy into the idea that, society benefits when work isn't unnecessarily repeated. So, innovation happens best when we're standing on the shoulders of everyone that came before us instead of reinventing wheels and resolving solved problems. Sometimes it can be fun to do that, or you can learn something doing that, but explicitly the goal there is not productivity. And it's, I like the efficiency and productivity of kind of being able to build off of other people's solutions and provide other people's solutions to build off of. And then also I like the idea that even though there's not one right answer, just like in math, let's say, there's not one right answer, but there are definitely a small set of right answers and a much larger set of wrong answers. And it feels good to figure it out and solve the puzzle and get to one of the right answers. And there's always trade-offs as to which answer is best, which one makes the most sense, but it's fun to find one. And to share that with other people, and you get some validation, and you're helping them. And, and then the more I've gotten into it, the more I've been, the sort of inclusivity angle appeals to me. It's sort of nothing truly levels the playing field in all aspects, right? There's always many aspects of privilege, and, the country you live in, and the finances you're born into and that you have, and so on, and all of that stuff. And but in many ways, open source is a democratizer in that. So I don't have a college degree, and software engineering is luckily one of the careers where you don't have to have one to succeed. It's got value to have one, right? But it's not a requirement, which is nice. And so similarly speaking, I've interacted with people on open source that I've later found out are children, like teenagers, or I've interacted with folks that are disabled in ways that I wasn't previously aware of was a disability, really. Like, it didn't, kind of click in my head that people live lives like this. And then I learn about the challenges they have to go through after building up a relationship over something open source. And that, their life circumstances don't have to be relevant to the technology discussions, but they are relevant because they inform their perspective and they inform their ability to contribute and how much energy and free time they have and so on. So it's, it doesn't solve problems, obviously. Like, people still have limited time. They still have bills to pay. They still have disabilities to struggle with and systemic problems to deal with. But it's, it at least addresses some of the kind of accessibility things where there's not a lot of domains where you can freely interact with people all over the world. And you don't have to even know that you're doing that. And you can, and that can add value, but like, you don't have to. Like, I don't necessarily think about what country someone's from, or like in which ways they're different than me, or in which ways they're the same as me. We're just talking about some project or some technical problem or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, I like that. So I think it was in your LinkedIn bio or somewhere along those lines. There was like these two pieces that I highlighted. The one was finding ways to balance what I feel are ethical obligations to, and then emphasized all users of projects. So I'd love to dig into that and talk about what are these ethical obligations. From your point of view. I agree with that, by the way, but I'd like to unpack that some.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's on my GitHub README, and that so there's a lot of different angles that this rings true for me in. One of the ones that hit for me somewhat earlier in my career was people often are trying to drop support for older browsers. Right nowadays, maybe Internet Explorer is reasonable to drop, but there was a good decade where everyone really wanted to drop it, and it was just not reasonable to drop it. There was a lot of people still using it, and most of the people using it weren't using it by choice. They were using it because they either lacked the knowledge or the skill or the permissions to use something else. I think it was South Korea required government companies that contract with the government to use like IE7 or something. I don't know. There's like things like that, like throughout the world, and that lasted far longer than I think people expect. And so whenever somebody would quote percentages, they'd say, well, look, it's only 1% is using IE. Let's drop it. I realized that if I converted that into the number of human beings that represents, it was a lot less palatable to screw over those people, basically. When you look, so it's sort of, so I developed kind of a sense of how important it is to consider the human beings that your technical choices will be excluding. And there'll always be somebody. You can never include everybody that you can strive to, but you'll never actually reach it. That's okay. The striving is what's important, right? And maximizing what you can include. But it is a very different discussion when you say, 10,000 human beings a month won't be able to use our software or our site or our product. Is that worth this extra time and expense? And sometimes it won't be. And that sucks for those 10,000 people, but like, at least then you've made the decision with your eyes open, right? Throughout life, we all have to make decisions that are going to cause some sort of harm. And the hope is that the help and the benefit that they create outweighs that. Right. You could get into stuff about diet and animal rights. You could get into stuff about religion. You could get into stuff about capitalism, right? Like there's all sorts of topics, many of which are controversial to discuss, right? That where that kind of plays in. And I just think it's really important that you, when you make any decision or advocate for anything or against anything, that you are clear with yourself, honest with yourself about what harm you're accepting as a worthy trade-off for some other benefit. And it's not always a simple or objective choice, but at least with eyes open, we can all make those choices. And then the more that's just one example. I've also kind of, how would I say it? In my youth, I think I was like a lot of us in the 90s, casually used words that are now called microaggressions because it was just kind of what was done. Things that you didn't like were gay and stuff like that, right? And there's a lot of other words that, I could say that I won't, but eventually I sort of realized the harm that those could cause, along with a growing segment of society, thankfully. But the important part is not the specific words. It's really being aware of the harm that you can cause by not considering those that are different from you in some way. And so to bring that back to technology, right? Like, if I'm talking about like QS, it's a query string parser. That really doesn't deal with issues of ethics too much, right? It's just a query string parser. It's not like the last few minutes of what I've been saying is a lot bigger deal than a random NPM package. However, the mindset of thinking about people who are different than you and what they might need, and then being able to make the decision to say no often in open source, like in software in general, right? I think the quote is, no is temporary, yes is permanent. So you should be saying no a lot more often than yes, because it's an easier mistake to unmake. And so it's fine to say no, but it's really important to be fully aware of the cost inflicted by you saying no, and that you truly believe that the benefit of saying no outweighs the cost of it. And other people don't have to agree, but that'll be, that has to weigh into it. So I make a lot of decisions with my projects that people don't like. And they have to decide if, they want to use my project or not as a result. And they are welcome to advocate for what they want. But, the maintainers of the project, or the ones who do the work for free usually, are the ones who have to make that decision. But that quote that you referenced it's a kind of a way to remind myself that I have to constantly try and put myself in the shoes of the people being told no.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I love that answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. It's not much I can say after that, other than I agree. I mean, it was a hard. So one of the arguments that I've had sometimes when people say, well, only so few people, or a percentage always, of people uses our site on mobile and tablets. So, whatever. Mm-hmm. And like, but could it be that so few people are using it because the experience is terrible and therefore they don't use the site until they're in front of a computer because they would love to be able to use it on their phone, but it's just so terrible they don't. So, that's a different angle to think about it.
Totally. And I think that sort of fallacy plays into a lot of stuff where, like, for example, pretty much anytime anything does a redesign, there's always some outrage. And then sometimes, depending on the design, people end up being okay with it. However, it's very rare that a redesign is done in a way that doesn't threaten to remove the quote old one, and that gives users the free choice to move back and forth. That is necessary, in my opinion, for being able to actually demonstrate that the new one is better. Because something isn't better if people can't freely choose not to use it. And so if in any way you're preventing them from saying no to the redesign, that in this case, then you're probably afraid that it's not better and you want to force their hand. And guess what? That means it's worse.
Yeah.
Like if you have to force it, it's not better.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I was in that boat not too long ago when I was still on the MDN WebDocs project, we launched a
Mhm.
redesign, and one of the biggest comments was bring back the old one.
Sure.
We didn't have the option to switch. People made, because it's open source, people made a plan and you could use the old one.
Yeah.
There was some trouble with that because you had to keep the fork up to date and so it's not trivial, but there's some people that
Mhm.
quickly spun up because it's just a statically generated site, right? So you can stick it on Netlify or whatever.
Sure.
And so some people did. So maybe because the community kind of took it upon themselves to say, well, if you're not going to offer us that option, we'll create that option. And then if I think about the traffic, I guess the new design was better in the end because, traffic didn't take a massive nosedive because everybody was looking at the old version of it. But we didn't offer that option. Like Mozilla didn't
Right.
offer the option. The community created an option.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't have MDN is a bit different in that it's not a sold product, right? It's not something
Yeah.
people pay for or that people are giving their data to use, which is a form of payment. But and I don't actually have a strong opinion on the old versus the new MDN design, to be clear. But what I would say is that it's just there's just no way you can actually claim that it's better or worse unless you've given both choices the same billing, which means on the actual website. Right. And
yeah, that's fair enough.
And I think that there's a lot of cases where folks aren't concerned with what's actually better. They're concerned with some other agenda. And again, that's okay. That's a valid choice to make sometimes, right? Maybe you're resource constrained and the new one is cheaper to maintain than the older one. Okay. That's a valid reason, but don't pretend that the new one's better. It's just cheaper. Right. And if you're interested in it being better, then you'd run both and actually see. But right. And so there's again, there's nothing wrong with doing that. You just have to, in my opinion, you have to your ethical obligation is to be honest with yourself and others about the rationale and the justification. And it's okay if the justification is, we don't necessarily think it's better, but it's cheaper.
Yeah. And I mean, there's also then obviously from the other side of the coin, there's also giving yourself enough time to get beyond the change, beyond the who moved my cheese
exactly.
thing. Because that's going to be that's the natural knee-jerk reaction. If you land on a page that's like, whoa, what the heck just happened here? There's going to be a while for you to take stock of where everything is again. Of course, sometimes you can change things so significantly that it's just not usable anymore. But that, again, kind of applies more to applications. I know there was a point where Adobe redesigned Photoshop to the point where people said, aren't you glad you know your keyboard shortcuts? Because if it wasn't for that, your productivity would have just grounded to a halt because the interface
Microsoft
changed.
Office did that too.
Yeah, it changed
they
so
redesigned all of their menus, but all of the old shortcuts still worked for that exact reason. And it's
So interesting. Well, you maintain a lot of open source, a lot of stuff that I depend on, a lot of stuff that a lot of people depend on. How did it happen that all of this landed with you, and how do you manage it?
Yeah. So the vast majority of my popular packages are things that I didn't create, but instead inherited. So somebody made it. I found it useful. I helped out. And then at some point, whoever made it stopped being involved and, then or earlier had handed me the keys. And then I continued to maintain it. So, I mean, that was the case for NVM, for the ES5 shim and ES6 shim, and so on. I've made a bunch of packages like the ES5 and ES6 shim are sort of pre-NPM packages, right? They're like a big pile of software that you're meant to just dump in a script tag and it installs things in the environment. And so I started making standalone packages for each individual thing that doesn't mutate the environment by default. And so I've made a bunch of those. And then some of those have gotten, used by folks who want that functionality piecemeal. And so then there's a lot of, I've made a lot of smaller packages that are shared across all of those polyfill packages. And so some of those are kind of transitively have a lot of dependencies. And then I think I've just, I've really bought into the kind of small module philosophy of NPM, the Unix philosophy of a thing should do one thing and do it well. And I think I've just developed a sense, not a unique one, just, after a couple of years of doing this, right? I've developed a sense where I can see some code and I can see the same pattern being used in 2 or 3 places at least. And then I say, oh, that would make a really great package. And then I pull it out and test it even better than it was tested before, and then publish it. And then I use it in both of those places. I think there's a lot of value, as I mentioned earlier, right, about reinventing wheels. The number of packages on NPM that do this, that are duplicates, where it's like, pick a small task. There's probably 1 to 10 packages on NPM that solve that task. And for most things, those packages are identical. There's not like a different philosophy or mindset in terms of the behavior of the package. There may be a different philosophy or mindset in terms of what they support in terms of back compatibility, or what module format they're authored in, or whether they have TypeScript types inline, or whether you have to get them from definitely typed, or, so there's things, but by and large, they're the same package. And we would all benefit a lot if all of those consolidated to 1 instead of being 10. But 10 is even better than no packages at all, because then you'd have a million copies of it lying around. And especially in a world where we're all kind of the wider, like, governments and industry are becoming aware of the actual risk of open source supply chain security. Mm-hmm. It's really important that things are actually in packages so that you can identify when a vulnerability is present, like in your graph. Otherwise, you have to kind of look for code and heuristics, and that is not as tenable or reliable.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this kind of plays into the second one that I quoted from your GitHub, which is I interact with the very real problem of time management, burnout, and work-life balance. So thinking about all of these things, so I have a couple of things. So for one, before we touch on the mental health aspects, and as a maintainer of so many things, this is related, but slightly on a tangent. So I know there's another friend of mine, at least, who has the same tendency to be working on something and then exactly reach that point of conclusion that you just mentioned, where it's like, wait a minute, but I've done this one thing before. I should make, and then you go to GitHub, make a repo, and then all that kind of stuff. How do you, maybe you don't have an answer, and that's fine. Because I don't yet. Not how do you stop yourself from doing that, because I think it's a good thing, but how do you stop yourself from getting consumed by that, so that you're kind of like, I don't know, just going off creating repositories all day instead of finishing the actual task you were supposed to finish?
I don't have a silver bullet answer. Everyone's got to cope with their own, unique form of mental illness to figure out how they can manage that. I definitely do that. Like I'm trying to complete a project, and then it ends up that I have to step away from it for 3 or 4 days so that I can get 4 other packages built so that I can then use them in the original package, right? Like that definitely happens. The image that popped in my head is Bryan Cranston's character from Malcolm in the Middle is going to fix like a light bulb, and then like the fuse doesn't work, and so then he goes to the fuse box, and then he has to go get a screwdriver, and then the drawer the screwdriver's in is loose, and he keeps, and I think his wife finds him under the car, and she's like, "What are you doing?" "I'm trying to change a light bulb." It's that is a real thing that afflicts a lot of us. I think that my hope is that I strike a good balance there, and where sometimes I let myself go off on the tangent, and sometimes I'm like, no, I'm going to leave it to do comment or leave a little note for myself, and then I'm going to just type it again or copy paste or whatever, and then come back to it. It really kind of depends on the urgency and what my schedule is and all that stuff. But yeah, no simple solution, because like deciding not to go on the tangent means that you're creating tech debt, maybe a tiny amount, but it's still tech debt. And creating tech debt is a addictive path because it can make you feel real productive. Look at all the things you've got done. Just don't look at the to-do comments behind the curtain. But unless you actually go back and do those things and make them to done, then it's like you're not actually as productive as you think. And this happens a lot in, product organizations and companies, right? Where someone sets a deadline and then tells people to build it. And they're like, oh, we have to fit it in that deadline. And, and then they cut corners and leave to do comments and so on. And then nobody ever makes roadmap time to go revisit it. So I've got enough PTSD from that process from my employment that I think I try really hard not to fall victim to it in my own stuff in open source. But yeah, everyone's got to figure that out for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, so there's some discipline involved there, which people don't like to hear.
Absolutely.
So talking about the mental health aspect, so from a different couple of different perspectives, maybe, like, for one thing, while the open source community in general and my personal experience has been really, really positive, I know that that's not the case for everyone. It kind of harkens back to what we talked about when you said obligations to all users. So, and that's also thinking about how people are experiencing a situation that's not the same as you. So, sometimes you get people who aren't nice, people who are buttholes, and people who demand things from you. There was not, I mean, it's talked about a lot, but I think very recently there was this talk, I think it was at All Things Open. I believe somebody had a conference there which says pretty much what boils down to is you don't owe them anything, which is hard, but that's what it boils down to in the end of the day. So with all the work you do in the open and open source specifically, what are some of the challenges that you've run into that have had a real mental health impact on you, and what have you found works for you to be able to find sanity and find peace maybe again?
Yeah. Okay, well, this is going to be a multifaceted answer. So first of all, is I've sometimes, more than I'd like, I'll say, been the person who's not nice. Whether I'm in the maintainer role or not, when I'm doing that, I mean, I'm not perfect, and I'm certainly less perfect than I want to be. I have found that in all things, technical problems are easy and human problems are hard. And the better I get at detaching and letting go from the best or a right answer, the very thing that motivated me, I talked about in the beginning, the more I detach from that and let that go, the more I'm able to think about the experience the other person is having. And I want them to walk away happy that they interacted with me and enthusiastic about interacting with me again. And I'm wording it very carefully because I think it applies just as equally in open source as it does in my professional life, as it does with my family and friends. It's really easy to get stuck on the details and focus on being right instead of getting it right in terms of the relationship with the other people. So that's just a sort of long-term personal growth thing that maybe if I live 500 years, I'll get really good at. Another facet of the answer is people are have different thicknesses of skin. Some people can just take a lot of punishment or mistreatment. Some people don't even notice it because they don't pick up the social cues or whatever. But then there's also some people that, like, you can ruin their whole week if you make them feel bad with one comment. And it would be easy if you're one of the thicker skinned people to just say, oh, that person's weak and pathetic and I don't care. But there is some balance, right? Like you don't want to spend all of your energy making sure each person is happy because that's impossible. But you need to, how would I put it? Nobody should have to have a thick skin to interact in the world. However, a thick skin helps. And so that's been one of the things that I think has protected me, is perhaps as a result of, not being the most popular kid in schooling growing up. I've developed a relatively thick skin, so it doesn't bother me too much when people are dicks, basically. I don't have a lot of advice for someone that it does bother a lot. Because it's, just telling them, oh, well, it's just some rando on the internet is not necessarily going to be effective, even if it's true. Yeah, so that's like, I don't have silver bullet answers for mental health things either. The time that I think it was the hardest on me was one of the JavaScript language proposals was what ended up becoming global this. Basically a universal way to refer to window in browsers or global in Node. And we were trying to use the word global for it, but it turned out to not be web compatible. It broke websites. And so I ended up coming up with like a bunch, like I collected like 20 or 30 possible names. And I ended up, a browser told me, we'll test 5. Like they were going to check and see without actually implementing it if it would have broken the website. But I had to pick 5. And so I just did that. I made a judgment call. And out of those, I made a judgment call. I ran them all those 5 by the committee, but like the one I was pushing was a judgment call. And we ended up picking global this. And after the decision, like a few months after the decision was made, one or two very prominent on Twitter JavaScript thought leaders discovered this and were very unhappy with the choice of name for many reasons, and intentionally or not summoned an angry mob to the proposal repo. That was a very rough period of time. The solution I ended up with was I worked with another committee member to write a sort of document with a bunch of shoulds and musts of like things that we cannot do or can or must do, and then things that are like ideal. And then for each name, just exhaustively, for each name, people said, well, this is obviously the right choice and everything else is stupid. I would put that name and explain why it was just a non-starter, or like which musts it violated or which shoulds it violated, and put up that document. And basically everyone shut up and relaxed. And people still weren't necessarily happy about the name, but I can't afford to care if they're happy about it. The important part, like I'd like to, but I just, I only have finite energy. But the important part was that they actually understood why the decision was made. And then they calmed down. And I've found that to be the case often in life. I mean, I was angry about a bunch of stuff in the JavaScript spec, and then I joined TC39, and the number of things that I think are stupid is way smaller than before I joined, because I actually understand the context now. It's not, the list isn't empty, but it's much smaller. And so that I try to remind myself of that experience with the Global This proposal as a way to remember that shared understanding that is persuasively shared on both sides, like everyone's on the same page and agrees, yes, we understand each other, that is actually a really good path towards, possibly the only good path towards the like agree to disagree mindset that everyone loves to do to push their agenda through. With the shared understanding, we can actually agree to disagree, and without it, you're just making people resentful and, running roughshod over people. Or at least that's how they feel, which is very important.
Yeah. So has that, or could that, or should that inform how organizations like the TC39, maybe W3C, maybe open source governance in general, how they approach these kinds of things? Like, is should that whole, and this, like for somebody that's been involved in this, like you in TC39, you could talk to it from a like, this is just not practical perspective. So I'm interested in that as well. But could that inform how a process like this is done in future? So you say, you know what, the last time we did this, things blew up. And the way we like mitigated it or stopped it is by sharing context. Maybe we should front load that context this time and maybe see how that turns out. Is that a practical thing to do, or is it just like fever dream of something that?
It is quite practical, and you are preaching to the choir.
Okay.
TC39 has definitely done that. We like begun to do that. We've got what we're trying to do, the vision anyway, is to document why we've made our decisions. Because like the specification documents what the decisions are, but it does a virtually an almost non-existent job of explaining why those decisions are what they are. And so the vision is to come up with enough of a explanation of rationales and why things are the way they are, and like axioms, like truths that we cannot violate and why, such that all of the many people who have ideas, which range from good to completely batshit, to like can then themselves go to these resources, read through it, and figure out exactly what their proposal would need to change to be viable, or that their proposal is not viable. And then they don't have to feel as bad as they feel by having a human tell them. Sort of the same reason why linters are great on PRs, because it feels so much less terrible to have a machine tell you, that's wrong, than to have a person tell it to you. That it's just not worth humans doing style review most of the time, because like if you put it in the linter, they'll just do it and move on. It's like they barely think about it. But if you tell them, like it's like a rebuke. And so in the same way, historically, when people propose bad ideas, we have to tell them that it's bad and why. And if we're gentle enough about that, it works out okay. But it's difficult to be gentle enough about that, especially given the wide variety of people out there. And having, like you said, front-loaded context available, I think drastically softens that blow, because then the worst we have to do is link to things and say, here is the things you should read to understand the viability of your proposal. And then they can come to their own conclusion, which would be the same thing we'd tell them anyway. And, things are more efficient. It takes a while to get there to that vision for TC39, because there's a lot of people that have to agree about what the wordsmithing. That is definitely on a lot of our minds.
Is that also kind of like a situation of, I've done this twice, now let's extract it into a sentence, like that thing where if I answered the same question twice in 2 emails, then I create a blog post, and the next time I link it to the blog post type of thing.
Yeah, and actually one delegate just decided to put up a frequently asked questions repo that the committee has not reviewed yet, but like we're going to be reviewing in this month's meeting, and could serve the same purpose. Just kind of because there are like a lot of those repeated things, and it's nice to kind of point at a place that describes that.
Mm-hmm.
I can't speak for other standards venues, but I think that's definitely on TC39's mind.
Yeah, that's cool. I love that. That leads super nicely into something else I wanted to talk about. And I guess I was thinking of a different question now that I'll just throw out there. Like, so first of all, should people want to get involved in things like the W3C web standards and TC39? And if yes, where do you start? What is a good on-ramp? Is there some repos you can look at, or there's some people you can talk to? Like, how would you get into that whole thing?
Okay, so should they? With the caveat that the room already can have 60 to 80 people, and we can't hold thousands. So it's like even in a Zoom call, right? Like, but I would say yes, everyone should want to. You, at the very least, you should make sure that your your use cases are represented. That doesn't mean you need to be the one representing them, but see who's in the room representing use cases and see if yours are covered. If there's somebody to speak for you, then it's not necessarily as important that you personally be in the room. That doesn't mean you wouldn't be welcome to be. It just means it's not as critical, right? But as far as how you could get involved, so TC39 has a proposals repo, which is the kind of definitive list of current proposals. You can look at each of those proposal repos, and there are probably over 100. And some of them are actively championed and they might welcome the help, but they don't really need it. Some of them, however, definitely need help. And I think it's most useful if you don't just the same way you wouldn't just go look for an open source project just so you can get a more colorful GitHub chart, right? You don't want to go look for a proposal just so you can do something with TC39. However, find something that actually works with your use cases, that's something that's like solves a pain point you've had, because then you can speak about that and that can give you some motivation to work on it. And then, just kind of look through a proposal, see what the deal is. You can look at the spec itself. There's issues the issues are going to be hard to, there's all the easy stuff tends to be done quickly. So like it's not really the spec isn't really a project that has good first issues in the way that lots of software projects can have. But if you find something that you think you can fix it. Or if you think something could be made better, like, you can always file an issue and ask, or you can, TC39 has a matrix channel. You can hop in there and ask the question, and people will tell you if it's worth doing. And then, we have the matrix channel. So you can lurk in there and just see what people have to say, or you can chime in if you have something to add.
I like the idea of lurking early on.
Yeah. I think in general, it's always good to, when you enter any new space, to kind of observe quietly for a while before you try to contribute, so that you know the most effective way to do that. So, and then, the other thing is ECMA is their members are largely companies. So your employer could join ECMA and then you could attend as a delegate. I would encourage you to do that. If for no other reason than the more companies have a foot in the door there, then the more diverse viewpoints we can consider. If your company has limited budget, I may suggest putting it into open source sponsorship instead, but both is good.
Yeah. What is there? So for an individual to be involved, even if it's on the periphery of all of this, like, what is there to be learned? Like, if you're an avid JavaScript developer or web developer in general, so you play with all the things, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, what is there to be gained from having a look at these things, being aware of what's going on here, and being a part of it? And then you kind of touched on this already, so feel free to just not answer this part if I'm asking the same thing again. And what can you contribute back? Maybe there's different ways of contributing, is what I'm trying to get at, I think.
Sure. In the same way as you don't have to know anything about how a car works to be a great driver, but if you know how a car works, you might be a better one. And in the same way, you don't need to know anything about the spec to be a great JavaScript developer, but you might be a better one if you did, right? And so it's not a requirement. It's not a gatekeeping thing at all. But there's a lot to be learned in the sense of when you master an abstraction layer, it helps to learn about the layer below it, even though the mastery does not require breaking the abstraction. And there's a lot of abstraction layers that you could talk about there, but I think the spec is certainly one. And it can be useful to know, like, which parts of JavaScript are in the language and which parts are in the browser or Node or both, or all three or whatever. And it's a fun bit of trivia that people talk about, that set timeout isn't actually in the language, but it's in basically everything that implements the language also. So, it's useful to just be aware that there is a segmentation in where things are defined and implemented. Even if just to know who to complain to when it's not working right. And then as far as how you can contribute back, the most valuable thing is perspectives and use cases that we haven't already considered. Because if it's not a new perspective or use case, it's just an opinion. And that's helpful, right? That's not like valueless, but the room's full of opinions. So the thing that is objectively of value is a new perspective. So if you have one, throw it in, and you don't have to be in the room to contribute that. You can file it on a repo or whatever. There's a discourse, there's the matrix, right? There's a lot of ways to inject your use case, and if it is in fact a new piece of information, guaranteed it will make it to the right people.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, no, that's great. I like that. I like that idea of, sometimes you forget that there's a layer below where you are, and that there's value in understanding, at least to some extent, what's happening there. All right. So during that conversation that I mentioned with the folks from Open Web Docs, I brought up this topic that was discussed on it's like a community meeting that I was in from the open source collective folks. And I think one of the biggest topics right now, it's probably always been underlying there, and it has like kind of peaks and valleys, but I think we're at a peak now again, is like open source sustainability and how do we maintain this thing. You mentioned some of that early on when you talked about the supply chain and the security of it, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's about the people, but it's also about the overall infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. And so they were talking quite a lot about that, and they were talking about some ideas that they were exploring, and somebody basically talked about what they've been researching and some ideas they have. And what it boils down to is this idea of using public money to fund open source, and therefore seeing open source as a public utility, and therefore it needs to be, it's everybody's responsibility to maintain it. The interesting thing there, and I think one of the examples of that is if you think about the folks in Germany, what are they called?
The Sovereign Tech Fund?
Sovereign Tech Fund. There we go.
They're actually the ones that are indirectly funding my OpenJS contract right now.
Oh, okay. Now I know more people because they also fund Open Web Docs, the BCD stuff they're doing. So I think that is very interesting. But my question was, how does this play out in developing countries? Like me being from South Africa, I know somewhat about the government and what's going on there. And I find it very, very hard to see a world in which the South African government would fund open source in, anything that even slightly resembles what's happening in Germany. And so there were some ideas thrown around there. And one of the ones that was interesting was this idea that it could be an economic boom if the government looked at it from that perspective, because you could almost create like a kind of open source Silicon Valley kind of thing where people are like, oh, I want to go live in South Africa because the government over there like literally funds people to work on open source. And I want to be one of those people. And I think, again, interesting idea, but I'd love to hear your thoughts around this whole thing about using public money to fund open source and maintainers, keep the security in check, all this stuff, and how that could play out. Like, what ideas do you have? How that could play out, and then how it can play out specifically in like developing countries.
Wow. Okay, let's see. So certainly it will be different country by country. In terms of some countries have more money to spend than others, and populations who are more empowered to work on programming things than others, right? Empowered in terms of access to resources and so on. But for a minute, I'll speak in general terms. The world is capitalism. Without speaking to the merits of that system, that is the system. And the only levers you have in capitalism are capital and regulation. That's not the only motivations, but those are the levers. And the purpose of government in capitalism, it can be argued, is to fill the gaps that profit motive does not. So, for example, countries will invest in roads, electricity, sometimes healthcare, other things like that. Because if they didn't, they wouldn't exist. Or they wouldn't get sufficiently funded because there's not enough profit in it. But they need to exist for the capitalism that exists to continue. So, because, and it's not that capitalism is necessarily intrinsically good or bad at doing anything. It's just that if there's not profit to be had, capitalism won't do it. Right? Hopefully, so far, I'm not saying anything too controversial.
Nope.
The open source is objectively something that is not sufficiently invested in by corporations, or individuals. Some of them do a great job, but in aggregate, everyone does a terrible job. And therefore, if we believe that things would not go well if open source were to all break overnight, which seems pretty much like a given, that is something that governments are obliged to invest in to ensure their country's productivity in terms of participating in capitalism and the economy. So I can't speak to any specific country, but I would expect that my hope is that more countries follow Germany's lead here, including my own, the US, and invest in the things that they have a vested interest in succeeding, which very much includes open source, especially security around it. And, I would add that the security of a software project is bottlenecked by the stability of its maintainers. And that means that if their lives are not funded sufficiently that they can be unturbulent, that's not a word, but calm, then the security of the project is threatened. So I think I consider that explicitly part of the job of ensuring open source security, is ensuring the stability of open source maintainers. Not everyone may consider that part of it, but I think that it is intrinsically coupled to it. So then, as far as an economic boon, I mean, the government. So for example, I've been asked a number of times, like, if I could wave a reasonable magic wand, what would I do for open source? And essentially, I've given a similar answer about capitalism, and I don't necessarily need people to give me money. The government could give me free healthcare or tax credits or tax write-offs. The government could, give me electricity discounts or a card that gets me discounted, like, gas or electricity for charging, for filling up my car, right? Like, there's all sorts of ways the government can reduce my expenses without giving me cash, or they could give me cash, right? They're about the same. But like, the purpose being that, so my packages account for 5 to 10% of NPM's download traffic, depending on when you measure it. That's terrifyingly high. And I cannot justify maintaining them full time. I can justify maintaining them some percentage of my time based on the Tidelift and GitHub sponsors and Open Collective income that comes in, but not enough. I have a family. I live in I have roots in an expensive place to live, and so on. So, if someone who's at this level of reach can't do it full time, how can anyone? Like, if I were 20 and single, I could probably do it full time, but I am not that unencumbered anymore. So, so as to your comment about, like, well, it could be an economic boon. Absolutely. A country that is, like, if I'm looking at, well, I can keep getting a job and squeezing in open source and then living the life I want to live with whoever, with my family or not, or whatever the situation is. But then some countries like, hey, move here. and you'll have basically no expenses as long as you maintain your open source according to these reasonable standards. Like, that's a pretty hard deal to turn down, right? Like, not everyone will be able to take it. I mean, I have kids in schools and we have friends and family here, but like, that's a hard sell. You know what I mean? That's like a good option. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of people who would do that. And, you know, so I think that I don't know if that's I don't know how it will play out. And I don't know if I suspect that there are many different ways it could play out depending on how creative an individual government gets. Mm-hmm. But I mean, a lot of people film TV shows and stuff in Georgia or Louisiana, I think, one of those two, or maybe both, because they offer crazy benefits to the companies to do that. And I'm talking about the US states. And like, you know, so these sorts of things work in practice. If you want something to happen, relieve the capital burden of doing it, and people will do it where you want it to happen.
So, yeah, I mean, from a purely like, does this make sense? Would people be interested if this existed? I can 100% see that being like you said, like it's like if somebody offered you that job, like you wouldn't say no. But then I guess the question then becomes, how do you demonstrate to a government the worth of open source so that they will then turn around and say, okay, we see, so therefore we will do this thing that will then end up in this like utopia for open source developers. Any thoughts there?
I mean, how do you convince somebody of something short of actually causing the disaster you're trying to prevent? I don't know. I could definitely like go rogue and inflict millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of economic damage. I'd burn my entire career in the process, but I bet a lot of governments would be willing to put money into open source. But like, I don't know how to ethically convince people of it other than just talking to people and advocating for it and, you know, making it more normalized to do it. So in other words, right now, one country has this fund that I know of. And if more countries have it, that's an example to point to. I mean, that works in companies too, right? I've in the past, I asked an employer like, hey, can we join this foundation? And they listed off 6 companies that were of similar growth stage and, you know, not directly competing, but like similar companies. And they're like, what he said, what do they do? Do they join this foundation? And if I had said, yes, they're in it, he would have said, great, we're doing it. Yeah, and I said, no, that they're not in it. So we didn't do it. And like, so people, I mean, humans are a social animal, right? So governments will do what other governments are doing.
Yeah. So a little bit of peer pressure.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So therefore we should celebrate and constantly talk about those who are the exemplars in this situation, so that, you know, it sounds to me like that's almost the only way of doing this is by talking about it so much that people are like, we're going to miss out. Like, we should do this now. We shouldn't wait until we're one of the last ones doing this.
Exactly. And there are incidents, security issues, things that have happened that you wouldn't want to talk about publicly because there's a real human involved in that. But like that in a smaller, more safe venue, there are a lot of mental health issues you could talk about that have caused incidents. There are a lot of lack of leverage issues. Some maintainer isn't getting any value out of maintaining a package, so they just hand it over to someone who maybe wasn't as trustworthy. Maybe if they were getting value out of that package, they would have been more careful, right? There's all sorts of things you can anecdotes that are like real things that you can say, look how easy we could have prevented this, and look how costly it was. Like that help kind of underscore, without creating new damage, that can kind of underscore the risk. Because like I said, capital and regulation are the only levers, but they're not the only motivations. There's also like profit is one of the motivations, but there's also risk, like risk minimization and avoidance. That's a main motivator.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And there's
it's
a lot of others.
Yeah. Risk mitigation is a big one. Yeah, this is such an interesting topic. It'd be nice to know, like, seeing that Germany's doing it. It'd be interesting to know if there's other European countries, such as maybe France, maybe Netherlands. I'm kind of surprised the Netherlands wasn't the first ones to do this, but it'd be interesting to know whether there's something brewing there, and then understand how that happened. Was it someone inside the government that kind of made this, or was there someone from outside who knew someone on the inside that could kind of like funnel in information? I don't know. Like, is it a grassroots level thing where you start this and it kind of gets a lot of support and the government later can't ignore it anymore? Yeah, there's so many ways to think about it, but yeah, I agree. The like going postal one is not the one you want to do.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. government just put out a request for information, and the deadline was last week, I think. So I know a bunch of foundations and companies that submitted papers that, I know I'm sure at least one of them was essentially advocating for the U.S. to create their own version of the sovereign tech fund. Hopefully more than one.
Yeah, which is another way to think about it, because if a country like the United States does that, that's going to set a massive precedent for the rest of the world. Because if the United States takes it as seriously to the point where they're like, we're going to now use some of this money that we have to constantly debate about to fund this stuff, a lot of other countries are going to say, wait a minute, what are we not seeing? What are we missing here?
Yep.
What's
well, and I also mentioned on a previous podcast with that when I was asked about a regulatory magic wand, I said, well, if the US and the EU, just those two blocks, said every company must demonstrate that they have contributed 0.1% of their profit, not revenue, profit, to open source, and back, sponsoring conferences counts, paying for your own employees to write PRs counts, putting money directly into open source projects counts. Something that tiny, it would be peanuts for individual companies. But first of all, that would create a ton of jobs, as companies would pop out of the woodwork to take companies' money and be able to prove to the government that the companies were doing what they said they would, right? Compliance companies. But on top of that, that alone, I think that probably the top 10,000 open source maintainers in terms of reach would be able to work on their projects full time. Something like that. Like, I haven't done the math, so I'm just pulling a number out of the air. But like I think such a tiny percentage of profit alone would allow a lot of maintainers to basically quit their jobs and do it full time. Yeah.
It's amazing to think about it. It's this whole 1% of the 1% thing. And so we close the entire loop and come back to the 1% we kind of talked about right at the top of this.
Yep.
Where like that 1% can make a massive difference, both positive and negative.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Jordan, this was a great conversation. I'm so grateful that you took some time out of your day to speak to me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for everything you do. Thanks for all the things you maintain and you keep up and running, and so the world doesn't break. But with all that said, how do people find and support what you do?
Yeah, so I am on my GitHub and Twitter and LinkedIn and everything. Username is LJHARB. And yeah, pretty much that on everything is going to be me. Hit me up. Like, you can please, sponsor me if you can. Much more effective than an individual sponsoring me is get your employer to sponsor. Yeah. Or have them join Tidelift, and then, money gets spread out among all of their dependencies, some of which will likely be me. Feel free to reach out with any questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day. And I'll be sure to put links to all of the things inside this is going to be a big synopsis, but it's cool. All right. Thanks so much, awesome. Jordan. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
You too. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Mechanical Inc. podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your friends. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Have something to add? Continue the conversation on GitHub and join the community on Slack. Until the next one, keep all the things open.